Welcome everyone to this tutorial. In this tutorial we'll be looking at CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheet. So in order to know a little about it, let's go to our web browser and open a new tab and just type CSS. So look for CSS tutorials by W3 School. So you click on it and it opens. So let's look at the first three lines, which I'm interested in. What is CSS? CSS is a language that describes the style of an HTML element, HTML document. CSS describes how HTML elements should be displayed. The tutorials will teach you CSS from basic to advanced. That's these tutorials of W3 School actually, and there are so many things that you need to know. You can just come here and check through. This is the home, and you can go to the introduction. It still explains much more about the CSS. Okay, you can go to the syntax and see how CSS is being written. Okay, so CSS can be implemented in 3 stages. The first stage is the inline, can be implemented inline. The second stage is internal, and the third stage is external. Now let's look at this inline. Inline is that the CSS can be written within the opening tag. Within the opening tag. Sorry, I think I will just have to stop writing. The CSS can be written within the opening tag of an element. So for example, in this my P tag, and I want to include a CSS in the opening tag of the P, I can just write my CSS right through it inside here. And this CSS that I'm writing within that tag, it only affects the T tag, the P tag, and any other element that is inside the P tag. But anyone that is external outside the P tag is not going to affect it. So that is what inline CSS is used for. The next one we say is the internal CSS. The internal CSS is written at the header section, at the head section of the HTML, and this CSS is only applicable within that HTML page. Outside that HTML page is not applicable. So which means if I write a CSS code in the head tag, I can have access to that CSS code all through my about.html. But when I go to index.html, I won't have access to it. It will not affect anything in my index.html. Although possibly I may have an ID here called paragraph, and I can still have the same ID in my index.html as paragraph. Let me use this A tag like it. But it will not affect this one since I'm using an internal CSS. So that is the limitation. Then the external CSS now. The external CSS is you write the CSS in an external file, saved with .css extension. Now that you can link it to as many pages as you want, and it will have it will make changes, or it will define how those pages are being displayed. So if I have an external CSS and I link it to this page and my index page, and all of them I make reference to this ID paragraph in my external CSS, it will affect this one, and also comes to the index page. When I log the index page, it also affect this one. So that is the 3 levels or stages that CSS can be implemented. And the order of priority is that the inline the inline CSS have higher priority, which means when you have an ID paragraph here, and you now write a CSS code here to change the color of this paragraph, and you still have another CSS code here that change the color of this same paragraph, and you still have another CSS code in the external sheet that change the color of this paragraph. This particular element, the one that you write in this element, the color that you select here, will be the one that is effective, because the inline CSS have higher priority than the internal CSS, and the internal CSS have higher priority also than the external CSS. So it's inline, internal, then external. Inline, internal, then external. Inline only affects the element, internal affects only the page, and external affect as many pages that are linked to that external CSS as possible. So now let's look at the basics of the CSS. All right. In the basics of the CSS, we have what we call the selection. Remember, I say that you can give an element an ID, you can give it a class. All right. So the CSS selection teaches us how to have access to elements in the HTML. And to have access to an element in the HTML, we can either use the ID, or we use the class, or we use the tag. Okay. All right. So you can use the ID, class, or the tag. Now, the ID is being referenced with the hashtag. Okay. In the CSS, use the hashtag to reference to an ID. Use the asterisk. No, sorry, the decimal. That's dot to reference to a class, and the tag, as we already know, use the tag name to make reference to the tag through the CSS. Now, let's look at the syntax for CSS. Now, in CSS syntax, aside from the inline, because the inline, even the inline also, but the inline make reference to a specific element, so it is not really applicable to some extent. So in the CSS, CSS syntax is that you write the selector, then you open a curly brace, and inside the curly brace we have the let's say attributes, and you follow it with full column, then value, then semicolon. You can have another attribute. Remember what I say attribute are, then full column, then value, a semicolon. So a man has leg. So leg is an attribute. But how many legs does a man have? A man have 2 legs. So 2 is the value of a man's leg. A man have eyes. Eye is an attribute. How many eyes did a man have? He has 2 eyes. So 2 is the value of that attribute called eyes. So if that is the case, we can say our selector, for example, man. Okay. Our attribute leg, full column, he has two leg, semicolon, eyes, and he has two eyes, semicolon. Then we close the curly brace. So this is the selector, the attribute, and the value. Okay, but we are not dealing with man, so let me just go ahead and delete this. So the selector now can either be the ID that can be referenced as the hash, then the ID name. Let's check. What do we give the ID? We give the ID paragraph, so hash, then paragraph. Then the selector, that paragraph can have a border, and let's use a simple one first. Color. Remember, we're using United States English, not England. So the color is COLOR, not COLOUR, please. COLOR. So we have the color, and we need it to be blue. You see, the attribute color can have the type of color we need, whether blue, white, red, green, whatsoever. We can have the background color, dash color, and this one also, let's say we give it white. You understand? So this is how the selector works. So to reference to a class, we'll have a decimal first, like this class, which is called the depth. In order to make reference to it, all we need to have is, sorry, let me clean this so that I can be able to use that. We are going to have dot depth. Okay, dot depth. Then we can go to color also and say we need it to be blue, and so on and so forth. So that is how to make reference to it. We have, aside from this ID selector, class selector, and tag selector, we have what we call the general selector. Okay, general selector. This selector initialize the values of, just like the way we start and I say the heading, font, and whatsoever it is the default of the browser. So the general selector is used to initialize defaults of a browser. So if you want to initialize anything, maybe the font size, if the browser is displaying at 12 fonts and you want the browser to be displaying your own web page at 13 font, you can initialize it. If the browser have two margin at the top and you want the margin to be 10, so that all the browsers, as they are displaying your page, it will be the same irrespective of the browser that is, whether Google Chrome, Firefox, Edge. Please don't use Internet Explorer. Internet Explorer is a wayward, outdated browser. So that is how it is. Okay, so the general selector is asterisk, just asterisk, nothing, just asterisk, and write what you want to write, like asterisk margin. I'll have it as 0 pixels, and padding, I'll have it as 0 pixels. So I remove every margin and every padding that any browser will put on the body, so that I will have my own body. So this is the introduction of the CSS. Later on, we will begin to see how to implement this CSS. Hope we have a very nice time. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next tutorial. Thank you.